First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and I thought today we'd do another book review. With all of the pandemic cancellations and closures, I've had a lot more time available to read and research. So I thought today we'd review Samuel Bates' The Battle of Chancellorsville, published in 1882. Bates was a well-respected educator and historian in his time who spent a good portion of his time dedicated to creating reference works like his catalog of Pennsylvania volunteers. In addition to his work on the Battle of Chancellorsville, he also wrote a book on the Battle of Gettysburg. I've been spending a lot of time recently collecting and reading more original works from the 19th century to expand my knowledge and research opportunities. While many people in the hobby will dedicate their expertise and their time to uniforms, drill, and weapons, not many take the less exciting route of sharing research and sources, and it's certainly not as glamorous or click-inducing as like rifle firing videos, for example. But topics like these are really important to the continuance of our hobby and the preservation of history. Another big reason that I began reading original works, well, more, because as I searched for them in Google Books, I noticed that in 19th century work, sharpshooters were mentioned a lot more specifically than in any contemporary work. It could be because, more soldiers were alive then, as were the rebels who also wrote about them. And so maybe you have some of this mutual soldierly understanding. And I think that led to more specific unit recognition in general in the 19th century. Even in maps, you'll often see much more detail on the battlefield and more unit identification than many modern works who, may only get as specific as the division level. So, the Battle of Chancellorsville, we kind of pick up where General Wadsworth's division was waiting to cross the Rappahannock on the 29th of April. And we read on page 52 that scarcely had 20 boats touched the water before the enemy on the opposite shore and opened a fire of musketry from his rifle pits, and was soon after reinforced by an additional regiment. In the face of the fire, it was impracticable to cross, and the Union sharpshooters disposed along the river's banks were insufficient to silence it. On the next page, we read that Wadsworth received credit as sort of like the big commander for our taking of the 23rd Georgia Regiment. On retelling the events of May 2nd, found on page 126, we're again mentioned specifically. The sharpshooters of Colonel Berdan, so famous for their marksmanship, were thrown upon the front and did excellent execution, the enemy fearlessly advancing in plain view. It was such a harvest of death as had never before been forced upon them to gather. That's just a sample of Bates's prose throughout this book. But yeah, I mean, the American Civil War, as we all know, has been written about in books by the thousands since it ended. And the more contemporary we get, the easier it can be to stray from the original source material. Or it could be harder to identify in an index. As we all know, it's great to read an exciting history, but we nerdy researchers are anxious to skip to the back and read their references. With so many books having been written, it's easy for authors to sometimes just cite each other's works. While not necessarily inaccurate, it makes tracing the primary sources more difficult for us. 19th century works are definitely not without their due criticisms, though. As we know, the 1880s and especially 1890s saw a resurgence in national interest about stories from veterans. Magazines and newspapers and publishers paid good money to the more famous veterans of the war to share their memoirs. So you also need to be mindful about any attempts at creating or trying to preserve one's legacy when reading works from the 19th century. But that aside, 19th century authors had some major advantages over contemporary authors and researchers. Many of the soldiers were still alive, and original documentation was still readily available. Bates uses both of those resources to his advantage in retelling the events of the Battle of Chancellorsville. It's a nice short book, but it's an exciting read. The Battle of Chancellorsville, as we all know, was a devastating defeat for the Union, precipitated by Jackson's flanking of Howard's 11th Corps. As Augustus Hamlin writes in his 1896 work on the battle, this led to the unjustly tarnished reputation of the predominantly German units under Howard's command. Bates' writing is at times poetically eloquent and also with facts presented like court proceedings. A stunning example of his prose begins on page 127, and it wraps up a chapter. So let's dig in so you can kind of get a sense of his writing style. This is a bit of a longer excerpt than I would care to read for a book review, but I mean, these couple of paragraphs just sum up his style and his use of words so perfectly. The chapter is A Morning of Bloody Conflict. General Hooker's chief anxiety was, as it had been from the opening of the fight at the early dawn, to get his troops upon the new line of battle. He had now given up all hope of any cooperation from Sedgwick, but the enemy was pressing with too much violence upon the troops still holding the lines to withdraw them rapidly without incurring disaster. Sickles, who, with Williams of Slocum's corps, had from the firing of the first gun been bearing the brunt of the battle, had now put in his last reserves, and ammunition was running low. It was the Sabbath, and the hour had come when the holy bells toll Christian congregations to worship him whose mission was peace upon earth and goodwill to men. But war, which exists by appeals to the fierce and angry passions, knows no sacred days. For 5 hours, one of the most desperate and bloody conflicts known in the annals of warfare had been raging. It was a contracted field, scarcely a mile in length and but a few rods in width. And around and over all was the gloomy, tangled wilderness, which even the unencumbered hunter rarely essayed to penetrate, and where game was as in its native wilds. Here, brave men were subjected to such a fiery ordeal as could scarcely be matched in the prolific brain of a Milton or a Dante. Neither party would yield, while the energy of despair, charge and countercharge were delivered with unsparing hand. The storm of buck and ball and tearing many was little more regarded than the hail of a summer shower, as the line swept on and over breastworks bristling with bayonets, only to be driven back, decimated and fainting from utter exhaustion. The fields literally ran blood, and the streamlets of the forest were crimsoned with the purple tide. A dense cloud of sulphurous smoke was perpetually rolled upon the field from the fiery mouths of 100 brazen monsters. Bursting shells and deadly missiles were hurtled in the dense air like the thick coming snowflakes in the midnight blackness of a storm-encumbered sea. The crash of musketry, the ear-bursting, deep-mouthed thunder of the artillery, the screech of the assailants, and the steady cheer of the countercharge were mingled in a cadence more fearful than the voice of the storm when awakened by the pealing of heaven's artillery, or the hoarse waves of the sea when aroused by the wintry tempest. To add to the ordinary horrors of a fiercely contested field, the cry went down the lines, "The forest is on fire! The forest is on fire!" It was too true. Lifted by the intense heat, the flames mounted heavenward and carried upon their wings the charred fragments of leaves and needles of the pine, the accumulations of annual foliage which the bursting shells had fired, until the signal of the burning field was visible to the two great armies and the country far around. It was a standard whose fiery folds challenged and defied the puny elements of man's warfare and the skill which directs mortal conflict. The fiery battleground was thickly covered with the wounded, the dead, and the dying. Brave men, as ever slept on tented field or faced a foe in the hour of battle, by the chances of the conflict had been left bleeding and helpless on that fatal ground. And could no human sympathy reach them? Must they thus miserably perish, wrung with the martyr's anguish? The path of the conflagration was along the most desperately contested ground, and the course of the fight went on unchecked. Tongues of flame licked up the dry foliage and leaped onward unstayed. Scarcely had the fire spent itself and passed to feed upon new material for its insatiate maw, before the charging squadrons rushed on over the charred remains of fallen comrades and were scorched by live coals in their fiery course. It was not a time to question the manner of death. A victory must be gained, and the mad ambition that ruled the hour recked not of bleeding wounds nor bursting heartstrings, of slow torture nor glowing pyre. The more than 20,000 who went down in the dread fight, by far the larger part fell on this little belt of forest through which a solitary brook murmured, unheeded, the clamor above and around, and unquenched by the blazing tide that swept over it. Yeah, I think that excerpt really sums up Bates's writing style and sort of like the flowing language of the book. And what's interesting about his work is when you have big excerpts like that, but you also have him pulling from a lot of congressional proceedings that investigated the battle. Additionally, while making his case in defense of General Hooker, he lists all of Hooker's communications before and during the battle in the appendix, so you can read the whole thing. Bates makes a compelling case, reviewing documents and recollections from the Union Army as well as those of the Rebel Army. He lays blame for the disaster on General Howard, with a mountain of communication informing him of Jackson's movements, and even communications from Howard commanding his division leaders to stop refusing the western flank and return to original formation. Cavalry General Stoneman probably gets a serving of deserved rebuke, as well as General Sedgwick, who, while at Fredericksburg, was to push the Confederate rear and reconnect with Hooker, which he wasn't able to quite do. Bates gives due credit to Jackson and adds a compelling analysis of Jackson's fall. The book wraps up with a nice heartwarming story of personal sacrifice by a Pennsylvania cavalry unit that threw itself upon Jackson's attack to spare precious moments for the Union Army. Bates also makes a good argument that Hooker did a lot of good work restructuring the army following Burnside's disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg. He also lays out that Hooker's move into Chancellorsville was a tactically well thought out and implemented one. However, when faced with the underperformance of several key generals, he made the prudent tactical move to seek shelter once again on the north side of the Rappahannock. Bates also well noted how Hooker was taken out of commission at a critical moment in the battle when an artillery round hit the pillar on the Chancellor's house. where he had his headquarters, and that knocked him senseless for quite some time. So, I mean, those are Bates's arguments, and you can read that and kind of make your own decisions based on that. I highly recommend reading this book if you're a fan of battle histories. You can find it for free in Google Books, as well as his book on Gettysburg. But I only paid $35 for this first edition, so that's a pretty good deal. And you can't beat these original prints in these books. I mean, modern printing just doesn't do it justice. So yeah, I would say like reading books like these it's a good way to expand your realm of research. So I learned about the congressional proceedings, which you can buy, and so tons of volumes. But I bought one so I can check it out. So that'll be coming in the mail shortly because of this. And they also, like I said, they have all the orders in the back of the book. So it's not like you have this big list of source abbreviations that you have to go and find which archive is holding on to them. You can actually just read it in its entirety, and that's kind of a nice rare treat when it comes to reading these old books. The maps are all right. They're not like the greatest thing in the world, but pretty good for its time. So thanks for joining me on this book review. Hopefully it'll, fill a spot in probably some open time that you may be having during this pandemic, whether just you're spending more time at home, or a lot of our events are getting canceled, so we don't have as much time reenacting, and so it's a good opportunity to kind of hit the old books and see what else we can learn. If you have like a favorite one of these old 19th century books that you'd like to recommend, let us know down in the comments. As always, thanks for liking and subscribing. And I'm going to tease our next book review. I got a big one I'm working on. I think it's like 6 volumes. So it's going to take me a while to kind of organize all of that, but it's full of good research. Anyway, have a good one, and we'll see you next time.